Well, my name is Dale Mills. I'm an activist with Occupy Sydney, but I'm also a lawyer, and so I'll be doing some legal support on the day.
Okay, and tell us a bit about what your evening is entailed tonight.
Okay, well, it was a very long meeting. It was a meeting that went on for just over 3 hours. There were perhaps 75 people there, so it was a very full meeting. People were very enthusiastic about the Occupy Sydney protest on Sydney, and there was over an hour's discussion about what's been happening internationally, particularly the Occupy that's been happening in Wall Street. So for Sydney, which tends not to have too much protest activity, it was a very big meeting and people were very excited about what was happening.
How many people were in the room?
I think there were about 75 people there in the room tonight, which for a Sydney organising meeting of protesters is a very large meeting. Meetings of this size happen in Sydney perhaps every several years, so it's quite a big meeting.
Great, okay. And from a legal perspective, can you talk a little bit about ideas that might help the protesters on the first day of occupation?
Well, I suppose the general position is that the way that the courts put it is that the right to peacefully assembly is jealously guarded as part of our legal tradition. And that right to protest, or that freedom to protest, has been hacked away little by more and more restrictive laws over the years and more powers to the police. What's happened is that it's assumed in New South Wales law that there is a freedom to protest and that there are certain conditions or restrictions put on that freedom. So when people go on Saturday, because some preliminary paperwork has been complied with, people can take part in a protest. They can inconvenience pedestrians, because that's the very nature of protest sometimes, and people will be complying with the law.
Okay. As far as occupation sites, my understanding is that we'll be deciding on a space to actually occupy. It is the Occupy movement. Could you talk a little bit about places in the city that are extremely bad idea, for example, of a place to occupy?
Well, Sydney has a patchwork of legislation and regulation which gives the authorities added powers in relation to protests. And so I would have thought a protest, for example, at the Sydney Opera House may not have been the best idea because there's quite onerous penalties available to the police if they want to deal with protesters or unlawful occupations at the Sydney Opera House. It's a political reality that anything happening in the Sydney Harbour Foreshore Authority area, down near the ferries at Circular Quay, or perhaps the Museum of Contemporary Art, I would have thought the police would pounce on people if they were involved in an unlawful occupation there. I think some of the better areas for people to occupy would be something like Hyde Park, or perhaps Sydney Square. But even in relation to Hyde Park and Sydney Square, if people were to unlawfully camp there, then they would be breaking the law. The real issue is not so much whether people are breaking the law or not, but whether the police will enforce the law. And that becomes a political decision. The more people there are, the less aggressive the police are likely to be. If those in authority think that it will be a high political price to pay, then they're less likely to enforce the law. And also the way that the protesters present themselves to the police will be important as well. A good example of that is a protest which blocked off both sides of George Street on a Friday night at peak hour between 5 and 7 p.m. several years ago. This was a protest by the Tamil community, and they blocked traffic in a way that was very disciplined and very polite towards the police. They walked onto the street and sat down and refused to get up. 2 hours later, the spokesperson for the Tamil community occupying George Street gave a nice speech, thanked the police. They all got up, and within 2 minutes they had dispersed. When protesters show that degree of discipline, the police have difficulties dealing with it, and they're more likely to adopt a gentle approach rather than attacking individuals and arresting them.
Okay. you have any further advice about protester behaviour or decisions that the group might make that might seem harmless, but could turn out to be quite, could enrage or the authorities unwittingly. Let's put it that way. Just hold for a moment. Okay, would you like to go?
Well, a lot of protesters, including myself, don't own cars, and so it never occurs to us that blocking the street and blocking traffic can be a real worry for the police. But that is something that really concerns the police, because the police, by and large, all own cars and they can all drive. So there's a bit of a cultural difference there between the police and protesters. We don't really care whether the cars are blocked and traffic is inconvenienced. The police do tend to be very concerned about that. So that's always a bit of a hot spot when it comes to the police. Similarly, there are some things that concern protesters that the police really don't care about. One is wearing identification. Any police officer not wearing identification or covering it up with a yellow vest will really annoy protesters. But the police and their supervising police officers don't really get it. They don't realise that that's an easy way to wind people up and annoy people really very quickly. I think generally in dealing with the police, although the law frames your dealings with the police, essentially it's a power struggle. If there's 100 protesters and one police officer, there really won't be any arrests. But if there's a lot more police officers than protesters, then arrests might very well occur. Some of those may be unlawful arrests, and there may be remedies and ways to complain about that later. But what the police will do is simply carry out the arrest and leave those things for other people to worry about later.
Okay. Have you got anything else you'd like to add? Or do you think are important points that need to be covered?
This is going out before Saturday?
Yes.
During the main Occupy Sydney protest, which is going to be in the Reserve Bank of Australia, there's going to be a number of workshops on protesting and the law, and so people should just keep a lookout for those and then come along if they want to know more about their legal rights on the day.